Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Said people, there is no more time to waste. Let's get into it. Because we are now incredibly down to 2 weekends left in the college football, if you want to call it the regular season, I guess you could call it the regular season. I mean, because we're going to have games this weekend, then we will have championship games the following weekend, but other teams will keep on playing. Just a bizarre season where there were a bunch of programs that finished their season on Saturday. South Carolina, Kentucky have finished their regular season. Arizona State played their second game of the regular season on Saturday. So it is obviously an unprecedented year. And what I thought I would lead the show with is this, is that I do think that sometimes I get so caught up in what are the storylines, Alabama, greatest team ever, and Brian Kelly, Notre Dame, Jim Harbaugh, whatever. And what I really realize is that I don't think I've done just a good enough job of kind of painting the picture of what matters in college football, which is the race for the college football playoff. And this is a good weekend, I think, to lead the show with this, because we have really had no movement at the top of college football at all. Incredibly, the top four in some way, shape, or form has been Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Clemson. Those teams have moved a little bit. But since Ohio State came back to play in October, the top four has remained the same. And really, the top seven in the playoff rankings have not changed. And there was nothing on Saturday that made it change at all, right? Alabama was a 30-point favorite and dominated. Ohio State dominated Michigan State. Notre Dame dominated Syracuse. Clemson dominated Virginia Tech. Florida dominated Tennessee. And so when you look at the big picture of the college football landscape, not all that much changed on Saturday. And so I figured rather than, spending too much time breaking down an Alabama win that we all saw and it was embarrassing and there was nothing to really add, what I thought I would do is instead just get you caught up on the playoff picture. What's happening? What needs to happen? Who's realistically able to get in? Who isn't? And all of that good stuff. And so what I'm going to start with is what I think is the most logical place, which is the teams that I think will get there. And then at that point, I will then break down the three kind of crazy scenarios that could create chaos for the college football playoff picture. First of all, I think it's safe to say at this point that if I think anybody who follows college football had to guess, I do think the most logical four to make the college football playoff are Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, and Ohio State, right? Alabama, even if they go to the SEC, if they go to the SEC championship game, they're going to be favored over Florida. That situation is set. I have seen no reason to believe that Alabama will not beat Florida, make it to the playoff. The Notre Dame-Clemson deal, Clemson will be favored against Notre Dame on a neutral field in Charlotte. And if Notre Dame basically needed overtime to beat Clemson, if Clemson needed overtime to lose to Notre Dame in South Bend, there's plenty of reason to believe that when Trevor Lawrence is on the field, that Clemson is going to get a victory. At that point, both teams would be 10-1. Both teams would be in good shape to make the playoff. And then finally, you have Ohio State in the Big Ten. And clearly their situation is a lot different than everybody else's. They're at most going to play 7 games this year. And the Michigan game this weekend is very much in jeopardy. And so because of it, we could be looking at a realistic situation where they only play 6 games. Although, again, we've heard it. We've talked about it on the last episode. The Big Ten seems to want to get Ohio State both into the Big Ten championship game and then also figure out a way to get them an extra game this weekend if for some reason Ohio State cannot play Michigan. And that reason, of course, would be Michigan has too many positive COVID tests. We'll talk about that situation with Jim Harbaugh in a little bit. But I bring all this up to say that's the four that I think we all kind of understand, like, okay, unless something crazy happens, it's probably going to be Bama, Notre Dame, Clemson, and Ohio State. And so what I figured I'd do is very simply this, is I would give you the 3 scenarios where I do think could cause craziness for the College Football Playoff Committee and really alter how things shake out and what ends up happening going forward. And so I think those 3 scenarios are very simply this. The first one, Florida wins the SEC title game. What happens there? Notre Dame beats Clemson for a second time. Would that eliminate Clemson? We'll talk about momentarily. And then the third is, of course, if Ohio State were to lose one of their next two games. So, first of all, let's start with the idea of Florida beating Alabama, in the SEC championship game. This is no disrespect to Dan Mullen, no disrespect to that program, but if that happens, it would be considered a shocker. I've put out feelers to friends in Vegas, friends of mine that are in Vegas. Alabama, assuming nothing crazy happens this weekend, if they have Najee Harris, Devontae Smith, and Mac Jones in Atlanta for the SEC championship game, they are going to be a double-digit favorite. So it would be a surprise if Florida wins that game. And if they did, it would probably be the most chaotic thing that could happen for the college football playoff scenario. And the very simple reason is this. All of a sudden now you really have 5 teams that are really qualified for 4 spots in the college football playoff, because in that case you would have Florida out of the SEC, Alabama would be 10-1, and it'd be hard after a season in which Alabama went undefeated in the SEC regular season to keep them out of the playoff. Assuming Clemson beats Notre Dame, you have 2 really qualified teams out of the ACC, Clemson being 10-1, Notre Dame being 10-1, and assuming Ohio State wins out, you have Ohio State sitting there at 7-0 or 8-0 or 6-0, And so to me, that is the single scenario that, assuming like chaos doesn't happen, right? Like assuming that Alabama doesn't lose to Arkansas next weekend or Ohio State doesn't get upset by this team. That is the scenario that I think causes the most chaos for the college football playoff situation, because if that happens, you now have 5 teams that are really qualified for those 4 spots. In my opinion, it would be advantage. Obviously, look, Florida's getting in. If Florida is the SEC champ at 10-1 with a win over Alabama, who was the number 1 team in the country all year, Florida would get in that scenario. I also believe Alabama would be in. At that point, they would still have 2 wins over teams that are currently ranked in the top 10. Georgia, which closes out their season this weekend against Missouri, and Texas A&M, who still has 2 more games left. But both those teams are in the top 10 right now. Alabama beat them both by 17-plus points. They beat Texas A&M, who could finish 9-1 by 28 points. And so they would probably have the best resume in college football, even with a loss to Florida. And so because of that, I think you're looking at a situation where there's 3 teams for 2 spots. Do you take Clemson and Notre Dame both out of the ACC? Do you only take one team out of the ACC, and do you take Ohio State? And which teams do you get in that scenario? The reason I think that it is the most interesting and why there's 3 qualified teams is I also think it brings up what is, to me, the most fascinating question in the dynamic of the college football playoff right now. And that dynamic is very simply this. How do you compare teams that didn't even start their season until the end of October with teams that have basically been going strong since July, right? And so in this scenario, that brings this situation to a head. Because if Florida wins the SEC championship game, Clemson wins the ACC championship game, I think Florida, Alabama, and Clemson are all very comfortably into the playoff. And then the question becomes, is it a 10-1 Ohio State team or 10-1 Notre Dame team or a 7-0 Ohio State team? And how do you compare a Notre Dame team which went 10-1 with an Ohio State team that went 7-0 and didn't even start their season until Notre Dame was basically at the halfway point? And so to me, that is the most interesting question in this college football playoff dynamic, because when I look at the college football playoff committee, I think that is the toughest thing that they will have to ask themselves. How do we punish a team that has been on the field doing everything they can to get games in since July, especially when it's compared with a team that wasn't on the field, that wasn't playing games, that basically was running through walkthroughs with no pads on through the middle of September and then decided to come late to the party? And I do think it's a fascinating question, and I don't know what the answer is, but I'll tell you this. This is just my personal opinion, right? I think it's going to be tough because there's 2 things that I think would go contrast in that situation. Remember, the committee is filled with not only ADs and people of that nature, but also of former coaches, of quote-unquote football guys, right? I know that's like a big cliche, pardon my take, they're great at what they do, football guy. Well, how does a football guy sit there and say one of 2 things? We're going to punish this team that's been playing since July, that has had no break. And oh, by the way, their only loss was to Clemson, who's maybe the best team in the country, preseason number 1, at full strength. How do we punish Notre Dame? But then also the football guy thing is also the Herm Edwards, right? You play to win the game. Well, if Ohio State is 7-0, at that point, how do you punish Ohio State, which won every game on their schedule? They'd be the Big Ten champ. And how do you fix that dichotomy? Now, if it was me, I hate to say it, Ohio State fans, I would give advantage to Notre Dame. To me, I believe that unless Notre Dame gets blown out by Clemson, right? That's the other variable here. If Notre Dame gets blown out by Clemson, then you can kind of look at that first game and say, well, they were at home, no Trevor Lawrence, Clemson still got them to overtime, they lost there. But if Notre Dame plays Clemson competitively, and I think they will, I would have to give advantage to Notre Dame, which had 4 or 5 games under their belt before Ohio State even came back. And so to me, that is the fascinating dynamic of the first situation. What happens if Florida wins the SEC championship and you essentially have 5 spots for 4 teams? The next 2 situations I think are equally as interesting because it's the opposite. You only have 3 spots for 4. You only have 3 teams that are definitively set for 4 spots. And so let's talk about those 2. So let's talk about the scenario actually that I believe that nobody is talking about, which I think is at least feasible and could happen. And that is the idea of Notre Dame beating Clemson for a second time in the ACC championship game. In this scenario, Ohio State would be undefeated, so Ohio State would be in. Notre Dame would be undefeated with 2 wins over Clemson, so not only would Notre Dame be in, I think they should probably be the number 1 seed at that point. And then, of course, Alabama is in, assuming that they beat Florida. Well, this is the scenario, first of all, that you want if you're a Texas A&M fan. Texas A&M fans need Alabama to beat Florida, eliminating the possibility of a second SEC team, and then they need either Ohio State to lose or they need Clemson to lose for a second time. And then all of a sudden, is Texas A&M the best team at 9-1 in that scenario? I also think this is where it opens the door for Cincinnati. Cincinnati needs help, but the one thing I will say that they have going for them, the best team on their schedule this year is probably Tulsa. They play Tulsa this weekend, and then they could play Tulsa again in the AAC championship game. All of a sudden, Cincinnati wins those 2 games and wins them convincingly. All of a sudden, the Bearcats are sitting there saying, wait a second now. A&M got smoked by the best team on their schedule. We're sitting here at 10-0. Won our conference, beat a top 25 team twice in the last 2 weeks. We at least got to be considered, right? And so I think that is the scenario that the A&M fan would be hoping for, Alabama winning the SEC championship, but then Notre Dame also winning the ACC championship. But I want to throw one more curveball at you in that scenario, because there's one curveball that I don't think anybody is talking about that I do think is at least worth considering here, and I haven't heard anyone else say it besides me. But if Alabama wins the SEC championship, eliminating Florida, and Ohio State wins out and they're in, and Notre Dame wins the ACC championship and they're in as an undefeated team, I think the committee, as crazy as it sounds, would at least consider Clemson as a 2-loss non-ACC champ. Now, you could be sitting there and say, oh, Torres, you're crazy. Of all your stupid hot takes, and you've had a lot of them, this is the worst one. And I'm not saying it would happen, right? But here would be the argument for Clemson. They lost 1 game without their starting quarterback on the road in overtime. The second loss, assuming it's not embarrassing, would be to the presumptive number 1 team in the country at that point. And are you really going to blame them for losing to Notre Dame twice? And then 3, you got to remember a few other things about this whole situation. Remember, the playoff committee's job is to pick the 4 best teams in college football, okay? It's to pick the 4 best teams in college football, and that is a very liberal term. Liberal in the sense that it can be construed a lot of different ways. Does best mean most dominant? Does best mean NFL talent? Does best mean good relative to their competition? And when you look at Clemson, I'm just telling you, it doesn't look like there are 4 teams that are better with the eye test than Clemson. With due respect to Cincinnati, Texas A&M fans are going to get mad when I say this. With due respect to A&M, I think you can argue that Clemson, even with 2 losses, looks like the 4th best team in the country behind Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Alabama. I'm not saying it'll happen, and I still think it's a long shot, And in that case, a Clemson fan would be hoping for chaos where Texas A&M were to lose a game, where Cincinnati were to lose a game, and the playoff committee is really backed into having no choice but to putting Clemson in. But I think it's an interesting scenario nobody's talking about, right? Like, everyone's just under this assumption that Clemson is going to beat Notre Dame in the ACC championship game. And to be fair, like, I do think it's a fair assumption. Again, they're going to be favored by a significant margin. Notre Dame barely got by them the first game. So I think it's fair, and I think it's worth asking, and I think it's worth considering, and nobody's talking about it. But I'm just telling you, if it comes down to this, Clemson, even with 2 losses, I promise you, will at least be considered. I don't see the scenario where they actually would get in unless A&M lost or something crazy happened, but it's something to think about, people. It's something to think about. All right, third scenario I want to get to really quick. This segment's already going longer than I thought. Would be if Ohio State were to lose in the Big Ten championship game. Or lose, period, right? It doesn't matter when it is. At that point, I don't think Ohio State has a leg to stand on, right? Like, I think Clemson, even at 10-9, they would be 9-2 in that case, I think would have a stronger leg to stand on than Ohio State losing before the end of the regular season. Because I think when you look at Ohio State, first of all, the crazy thing about Ohio State that nobody's talking about right now, their resume is really not all that impressive. Now, I'm really impressed by the Indiana win. I said I believe Indiana coach Tom Herman should be National Coach of the Year. But outside of that, Penn State is down. That win doesn't look good. Notre Dame is in a perpetual 2-decade rebuild, okay? That win doesn't look good. You might not play Michigan, and even if you do play Michigan, this team is absolutely terrible. That ain't going to happen. And so when I look at Ohio State, your resume isn't that good. In this scenario, you would have probably lost to either Northwestern or Wisconsin on the final day of the regular season. I don't see any scenario where if Ohio State doesn't win the Big Ten, that they're in the college football playoff. They're not getting in at large. I'm just telling you this. And when I say win the Big Ten, I mean finish the season undefeated. I don't see the scenario. I see the scenario where Alabama gets in if they lose in the SEC championship. I see the scenario where Notre Dame can get in, even Clemson, but not Ohio State if they lose. And that, of course, opens up the scenario where there's a lot of chaos. And does that 4th spot go to Texas A&M? I think Cincinnati would have a very compelling argument in that case. And I'll tell you this, that would also be the one that brings in some of the odd kind of crazy scenarios where can you get an undefeated 5 or 6-0 Pac-12 team? Can you get an undefeated Coastal Carolina? I don't think that one's going to happen. Can you get a 2-loss Big 12 team? Those are the crazy scenarios. I do think if Ohio State loses, though, it would be advantage A&M. It would be advantage Cincinnati. But I do think it's a fair question of, like, what happens if there's no team behind them? What happens if A&M loses a game? What happens if Cincinnati loses a game? But to me, that is the playoff picture. If you're asking me to handicap it right now as I record here, late December 6th into December 7th, I think the 4 are going to be Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, and Ohio State. But I'm telling you, man, Ohio State has ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys. They do have problems. There's the possibility that Clemson loses a second game. And I think there's a possibility that Florida beats Alabama because Florida is a really dynamic offensive team, even though I'm not picking it. One thing I will say, it is going to be fascinating to watch. It's going to be fascinating to see. Cincinnati's got 2 more games to continue to prove themselves. A&M has 2 more games to prove themselves. And I do think if A&M finishes 9-1, they will be in the driver's seat in case an Ohio State takes a loss, in case Clemson takes a second loss in the ACC title game. But it's going to be fun to follow. It's going to be fun to follow. And while Saturday's games weren't great, I do think we're headed for a really good playoff where I think Notre Dame, Clemson are both really good out of the ACC. I think Bama's obviously just a juggernaut. And I think Ohio State would cause problems for all 4 of those teams, even if there are some issues with them